benefits of free trade? Now, first of all, remember that what is a closed economy? A closed economy is an economy that only trades domestically. There's no international trade taking place. There's no international trade at all. So that's a closed economy. It trades internally, maybe between cities and states. That's a closed economy. And opposite to a closed economy is an open economy. An open economy is an economy that does international trade, right? It does international trade. That is, it imports and exports. That's an open economy. Now, when you talk about, so now there's a very popular question, exam question that comes in the past paper that says, what are the benefits of free trade? Right? This is a very important past paper question. What are the benefits of free trade? When you talk about free trade, you're talking about trade that is without any trade barrier. What are trade barriers? Trade barriers refers to protectionist measures. Protectionist measures, or you can say trade protection or protectionism policies. So basically these policies or these measures are designed to reduce free trade, right? More inclined towards reducing imports, right? So when you talk about free trade or trade barriers, right, so when we say that we are talking about benefits of free trade, that is a trade that takes place without any form of trade barriers, without any form of protectionism by the government, by the state. So for example, one of the measures to reduce imports is through imposing tariffs and custom duties. For example, Pakistan used to import a lot of cars from abroad, from Japan especially, and now there has been huge duties imposed on that, which has increased the price of imports, reducing their quantities and reducing import expenditures for the country. Now, there are various reasons why these protectionism is imposed. We will look into that later on. First, we are going through what are the benefits if there is no trade barrier, if there is no trade protection. Now, if there is no trade protection, we're talking about an open economy. So first, what you can write is that it encourages countries to exploit greater of the potential absolute and comparative advantage. So obviously, countries do have absolute and comparative advantage. Like I said, absolute advantage is a situation where countries can produce something at a low average cost, while comparative advantage is a situation where they can produce something at a low opportunity cost. Now, even if you just write this line without even knowing what absolute comparative advantage is, it won't really matter because absolute comparative advantage is part of AS syllabus, right? Or even if you don't write that, that's also not, first of all, it's not necessary for you to even write that. Okay? So so what are the benefits of free trade? It encourages countries to, you instead of writing absolute comparative, you could write it encourages countries to exploit their potential cost advantage. So instead of writing this down, you could write, it would encourage countries to exploit greater of their potential cost advantages. That would be a much simpler version. And that results into greater specialization. So obviously, if you have, like Pakistan has a cost advantage in producing agricultural goods. So that is why Pakistan specializes in producing agricultural goods. Now, why can a country have a cost advantage in something? Maybe because of labor productivity in producing those goods, right? Maybe because the factor endowment or the factors of production are naturally suitable. They are naturally suitable, not something to do with us, but they're naturally suitable. Like we have rivers, right? We have a good soil. Our geographical location is such. Or maybe because of good skills, or maybe because of, efficiency, maybe because of labor efficiency or high labor productivity. So because of this, what happens is that countries can now exploit greater of their cost advantage. When they exploit their cost advantages, so what we're trying to say over here is they make better use of it. So it's kind of also relating to efficient resource allocation as well. So if countries have a cost advantage and they are not exploiting it, which also represents an inefficient allocation of resources, wastage of resources. Country has a potential cost advantage, it should exploit that and then specialize in it and then indulge into international trade, export those goods as well. So that's a situation of allocative efficiency. You could also connect this point with the one I just mentioned. What I was saying was when you were saying that countries have a potential cost advantage, it simply means that they should exploit that. Exploiting that means making full use of it, right? So if you have a cost advantage, which means you can produce something at a low cost, maybe because you have good amount of labor for it, you have efficient labor is productive, you have factor endowment is naturally suitable, you have a technology that is suitable for it, right? So if you have that, if you have all these ingredients, then you should exploit that cost advantage by producing more of it and specializing in it. Instead of producing other goods as well, specialize in that in which you have a cost advantage. And this basically means that you are allocating your resources efficiently. Not producing something does not mean you should produce it, maybe because if the cost is high, it's better to not produce it and instead produce in which you have a cost advantage. So again, that's an example of efficient allocation of resource. Okay, this is what I was saying. Part 2 is, obviously, because of free trade, what happens is, if you guys remember the AD equation, aggregate demand is basically total spending, right? It's total spending. Now, total spending, I said, generates what? This total spending is equal to your real GDP, because what happens is when you spend, firms produce. So you spend, firms produce. We discussed this in the circular flow of income, right? So aggregate demand is responsible for generating an equivalent amount of real GDP, didn't we? That total spending is equal to an equivalent amount of real GDP being generated. So if exports is a component of aggregate demand, if your exports go up, your spending goes up, and so does your real GDP goes up as well. So remember that whenever exports would rise, so because of international trade, what we're saying is that your real GDP will go up, because obviously exports would result into export revenues, right? It would result into export revenues. And these are revenues for the domestic economy, for Pakistan, right? So if Pakistan export revenues go up, Pakistan's GDP should go up as well, right? So higher domestic output, because you're specializing in it, results into higher GDP. Also, another economic advantage is that it also results into reduction in unemployment. Why? Because obviously your export industry grows. If your export industry grows, because you're exporting more, you need to produce more, and for that you need to hire more labor. So it results into a reduction in unemployment as well. Now, you won't really call this demand deficit unemployment, right? You won't end up calling this demand deficit unemployment, because it's just one industry or the export sector that you're talking about. So also it results into increase in national incomes, and obviously when national incomes go up, so does tax revenues go up. And these increase in tax revenues, like I said, can be spent back on the economy by providing essential public services, merit goods. It can be spent on infrastructure, and that obviously would result into reduction in income inequalities, right? So also there is obviously, the higher the national income, the less the poverty, right? So poverty levels for the economy will go down as well. Moving forward, remember that if export industries grow, so obviously it can also result into external economies of scale so other industries may end up growing as well. So you may see that, there is growth of ancillary firms taking place, right? So for example, if Pakistan's agricultural exports grow, what will happen? Maybe there will be more industries being set for manufacturing more fertilizer, right? Manufacturing more pesticides. So there is growth of ancillary firms as well because of the growth of a certain industry. And this would result into more faster or quicker at a faster, so economic growth would arise at a much faster pace. Another advantage that what you can talk about is that, remember, the international trade is very important for, so yes, as far as developing countries are concerned, poor countries are concerned, international trade is very important for developing countries, because it's very important for developing countries to actually export and to generate those export revenues so that they actually have that foreign currency reserves coming into there for the state. and it's very important for their own economic development as well, right? So remember that the fact that a lot of these developing countries are relying on cheap raw material from abroad for their industry. So many developing countries, for example, let's say Pakistan imports a cheap raw material from other countries because that's cheap elsewhere, and Pakistan cannot produce that raw material. So it's very important for the export industry as well, because engaging into international trade would help. How would this help? Because if you're importing cheap raw material from abroad, it would make the exports competitive. Why? Because it will reduce the cost of production. So cost of production would go down, and even cost push inflation would go down as well, right? Cost push inflation would go down as well. You've already studied this, by the way. So there would be less cost push inflationary pressures in the economy because you're importing cheap raw material. So obviously, you can only end up importing cheap raw material if you allow free trade. Because if you don't allow free trade and you impose trade barriers, or maybe you end up banning trade at all, maybe you're a closed economy, then you cannot end up importing cheap raw material. So domestic firms in that case, listen to this line very carefully, that if you end up imposing trade barriers, right, in that case, our domestic firms such as your domestic, you could say domestic exporting firms would have to then rely on domestic firms for raw material, right? And this raw material would obviously be expensive. And what would happen is that this would make the exports uncompetitive. And this would make the profits of these exporting firms go down. And if profit goes down, so would GDP go down for the economy as well. So it's not good for the economic development of the country as well. So you could also mention this, that how free trade is beneficial for the country, because if you're importing cheap raw material, there are various cost advantages attached to it. And if you ban those imports, you actually end up banning the cheap raw material available. So maybe you're doing this to protect the infant industry or to protect domestic industry. Maybe you're doing this because maybe the government may do this just so that the sales of these domestic firms may go up. But then the point is that these domestic firms are inefficient and they are selling expensive raw material because they produce it at a much higher cost. And that then affects these exporting firms. Also remember that foreign currency or foreign exchange reserves would rise, because obviously when you export, that results into an inflow of foreign currency, right? That results into an inflow of, so foreign currency reserves would obviously go up. And foreign currency reserves go up, you can actually, especially developing countries who have taken loans from the IMF and World Bank, can actually repay those debts. So this will reduce the national debt of the country, basically. Remember that. It will actually end up reducing national debt. If this happens, then your debt to GDP ratio goes down. Right? So if a question comes on free trade or advantages of free trade, usually it will be a discuss question for 8 marks. There are so many points that I have mentioned, 6 to 7 solid points that you can write and score full marks actually. And a question usually comes on international trade. So and remember, a lot of times one good way of answering a past paper question is to either, if it's a micro, even in the macro, more in macro actually, to actually give reference to immediate consequences and consequences in the long run, consequences in short run and consequences in long run. There's also another thing that you guys should know how to relate your answers, is to relate your answers with either connecting your answer with developing economies or developed economies. So try to see what will be the impact. So if you're talking about inflation, see what will be the impact on developing country as opposed to a developed country. Obviously, developing countries may end up having a much worse impact. So similarly, if you're saying that foreign exchange reserves would rise, you could give reference to developing poor countries, that this will help them repay the debts. Because this point everyone will write. Foreign exchange reserves will rise. But what is something else that you will write that will make you look different from others is when you will be able to relate this point maybe with developing countries, that it allows them to repay their debts, which reduces the national debt of the country. Okay? Also, remember that because of international trade, let's say if your exports are going up, right? Although international trade does not mean that your exports are only going up. It could also mean that your imports are going up as well. But right now, since we are writing it as an advantage, we're assuming that that exports are more than imports. So remember that if exports are more than imports, it means that your net exports are going up. And if your net exports are going up, we could also rise at a rise in exports, so we could rise in net exports. Net exports is X minus M. So if remember that if net exports are in positive, it means exports were more than imports, right? If your net exports are in negative, it means your imports are more than exports. So if your net exports go up, it would reduce the balance of trade deficit. And especially we know that developing countries may end up having huge amounts of trade deficits because developing countries may import a lot. They may import consumer goods to, because obviously developing countries lack resources to produce good quality consumer goods for their own consumers themselves. So they import, right? We see that how much of imported products we as Pakistani consumers consume. Understood? Similarly, because we import from developed nations, so it would help. Also, developing countries may end up importing raw materials, competitive raw material. Also, developing countries may end up importing capital goods like machinery. Now, this is an evaluation that you can write as well. Although, yes, although imports are bad, right? Imports have a negative impact on your deficit. But then if you're importing capital goods, it may have positive long-term consequences because it will shift the PPC outward. It will result into economic growth in the long run. So that's an evaluation. Right now, that's not the point. I will come to those arguments in the coming classes. But as far as this last point is concerned, remember that a rise in exports would help reduce balance of trade deficit. If there's a deficit on the balance of trade, which obviously means that maybe in the past your imports are greater than your exports. So if your exports go up, your net exports go up in the future, it will reduce the balance of trade deficit on the current account. And remember that a deficit on the current account is not a good thing. We are going to study this in the BOP chapter, right? So also remember that this is a very good advantage that you can give. International trade results into a rise in world output and world incomes. There's a reduction in global poverty. Why? Because obviously, if countries are engaging into international trade amongst each other, they are not only selling goods and services to within themselves, they're also selling outside the country to other markets as well. So obviously, it will provide more employment opportunities globally. It will reduce global poverty, and also it will also result into a rise in world output. This is a very good point that you can write in the exam. Understood? Another thing what you can write is that international specialization, because obviously you end up specializing in products in which you have a cost advantage. When you talk about international specialization, for example, Pakistan specializes, let's say, in producing agricultural goods, right? Agricultural goods. So if that allows Pakistan to consume beyond production possibilities. Now, what do I mean by this? Leave this. Why? Because this is more relevant for an A-level point. But if you just want to learn it, yes, you can just learn it. Or maybe if you understand it, that's fine. I will not be spending a lot of time in explaining this. So international specialization allows countries to consume. So basically, technically what I'll try to explain a bit of it. It says that it allows countries to consume beyond production possibilities. So let's suppose if Pakistan produces maybe, let's say, maybe it produces 10 agricultural goods, hypothetically speaking, right? And if it specializes in it, right, it could end up producing 35 agricultural goods, right? Out of 35, it could end up exporting 5 and consume 30 locally. So initially, it was only producing 10, but now it is producing 35 and it's consuming 30. Actually, initially, Pakistan was only producing 10, consuming 10, because it was trading domestically. You were producing 10, consuming 10. Now you produce 35 and you consume domestically, you consume 30. So what I have written is that it allows countries to consume beyond their production possibilities. So you could now actually end up consuming more than you were actually producing before, right? So this is it. I'll keep it till here.